Here we go. All right. So again, this is Murray Amateur Radio Club, and this is the next instance of our Getting Started with Amateur Radio series. And we're doing these as part of our beginner classes this year to try to help people go from zero to hero in a year, right? So we'll see how that works out, but well, maybe. I don't know. We'll have to find we'll figure it out, but maybe I'll come up with a better slogan by next month. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, so normally we would have done this on the first Thursday of the month, but we swapped the first and third Thursdays because we had the meeting joint with Salt Lake Crossroads on what to actually expect in a real disaster. And Dan did a fabulous job on that. That presentation is on the website. If you haven't seen it, you weren't there, check it out. There's a ton of great information in that. And we had several comments from people, actual official emergency management people saying, this was great. We actually got, this is the best information we've heard in any presentation we've gone to. So Dan, you can shrink your head back down now, and we'll go ahead and get started. So tonight we're going to be talking about programming your radio. If you haven't followed any of the previous sessions in this series, we started out with like, hey, this is what ham radio is, and this is what it isn't. And so we kind of went through that. And then we talked about testing and how to get your license and stuff like that. And then we talked about, what did we talk about next? I don't remember. We had a couple of other classes. They were all in there somewhere. I don't remember what they were, and I don't have the list in front of me. But this one, we're going to be talking about programming the radios. Oh, it was equipment. What equipment to buy? What radios do you need? What do you need? That was one of them. So now you've got your radio, you've got your license. Let's go ahead and advance this slide. You've got your radio, you've got your license. Now you got to figure out how to program your radio. So what is programming a radio? It's not like a computer. Well, it is kind of like a little tiny computer, but it's not like a general purpose computer. But there's basically three aspects to programming your radio. There's configuration and settings. There's manual entry of frequencies and other settings that might be associated with frequencies. And then there's memory programming. And so we're going to talk about all of those. But what do I need to know first? You need the manual for your radio. Okay. And it was so important. I said it 3 times on this slide. You need the manual for your radio. You need the manual for your radio. So if you bought a new radio, it came with a manual. Okay. My radio didn't have a manual, or I lost it. What do I do? I don't know what to do. Well, you can check the manufacturer's website. Sometimes there's a manual that you can download from the manufacturer's website. You can Google for the radio manufacturer, model, and the word manual, and sometimes you will find a link to somebody who has posted it online. You can talk to other hams that you know and ask them if they have the same radio, and if they do, if they know where their manual is. There's also a website, radiomanuals.com. Those are not free. So if you need to go there, you can, but it's not a free resource. You have to pay for the manuals that you get from them. And a lot of them are bad photocopies of a physical manual. So admittedly, that's better than nothing. If you've got a complicated radio and you don't know what to do with it and you don't know how to make it go, it's better to have something than nothing, right? There's also DX Zone has a collection of links to radio manuals. They don't have the manuals themselves, but they have links to places where you can get them. So if you go to that link, you can potentially find a link to your radio. Now, if your radio is really obscure, you probably are going to have trouble finding a manual for it. If your radio is really popular, like the infamous Baofeng, you are not going to have any trouble finding a manual for this.
You won't be able to read it, but you'll be able to find it.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
Okay. I'm getting to that. No, but you're good. You're good. So I have the manual, read it. And I say right here, some manuals are really bad translations from a different language. And the Baofeng manuals are notorious for that, right? These are Chinese manufactured radios, and the manual is not in Chinese, but it was originally in Chinese. And now it's been translated to English by someone who doesn't necessarily know English all that well. So you can probably still figure out what they're talking about if you know what some of the terms mean. And sometimes they will use a term that you're not familiar with. We're going to talk about some of those as we go through this process tonight. So don't panic just because you haven't, you're looking at the manual and you're like, what the heck is compounder? I don't know what the heck that means. Do I need that? Do I turn that on? Do I turn that off? What do I do with it? We're going to talk about those kinds of things as we go through tonight. So don't freak out. No, we're not going to learn Chinese. The Chinese that I know consists of ni hao, which means you good, and basically is like saying hi. And the other one is shishi, which means thank you. And that's, in my opinion, there are certain phrases that you should learn in as many languages as possible. And thank you is one of those phrases. Another really important phrase is, where is the bathroom? And the third most important one is, do you know someone who speaks English? So if you can memorize those three phrases in as many languages as possible, you can probably get by. Because believe it or not, there are English speakers in the most obscure places on the planet that you would not expect to find an English speaker. English is the language of commerce, and that's probably because we have forced people to learn it. So if they want to do business with the US, they have to learn English to be able to do it. So if you can find someone who speaks English, you can get by usually. Now, there's actually this book which is awesome. It's called English as She Is Spoke. And I don't know if you've heard of this book before or not, but this book was written by some guys. It's a translation from Portuguese to English. But unfortunately, the guys who wrote it didn't know English. And they didn't have a Portuguese to English dictionary, but they had a Portuguese to French dictionary, and they had a French to English dictionary. And so they took those together and figured out how to make this phrase book for people traveling to places where they speak English. It is absolutely hilarious. It's available online. If you guys want it, I'll send you a link to it. But yeah, it's quite amusing. Let's put it that way. English as She Is Spoke. So yeah, how to speak English in Portuguese translated to French, translated to English. Anyway, yeah, so it's good. It's funny. Okay, so let's talk about some common settings. We'll get to tuning the radio in a minute, but first, what are all of these menu settings? So all of these radios have a button on them labeled menu, right? My TYT has a menu button, great big menu on the TYT. It's nice. My Kenwood has a button labeled menu. Baofeng has a button labeled menu. It's a tiny little button labeled menu in a tiny little font, but it's there. So the menu is where all of these settings are, right? So what do they all mean? Well, we're going to go through some of these. We're going to talk about them. So first one that you're going to find is squelch setting. Now, let me tell you up front, not every radio is going to have all of these settings, okay? Some radios are going to have a completely different set of settings than another radio. So if I talk about a setting and you've looked through your menu and you don't find anything that looks like that or sounds remotely like that, your radio probably doesn't have it, okay? So don't panic, don't freak out about that. Squelch setting, the squelch is the level above which the signal strength must be for the radio to open the speaker and let the signal through. So if you turn your radio on, let me turn this radio on for a second. Okay, this is my Kenwood, And if I didn't have squelch set, it would sound like this all the time, right? This is the background noise. So I have a squelch setting on here that says, unless the signal comes up above this particular level, don't open the speaker up so that I can hear it. And that means I won't hear that noise all the time, which I don't want to hear that noise all the time. Plus, if you're hearing that noise, you're also using more battery than you want to be using, because now the amplifier is working, the speaker is working, all these things are working that you don't need working when there's nobody talking, right? So the squelch is a number, typically goes from like 0 to 9 or some other range, depending on the radio. And you can adjust that. So if you want to pick up a pretty weak signal, you can actually turn the squelch down so it's closer to that noise floor. If you want to not hear those weak signals, you can turn that squelch up a little bit. Or if you find that the radio is opening and closing all the time, even when nobody's talking, turn the squelch up a little bit so that it has to be a little stronger signal.
So I understand what a noise floor is. What noise what?
Noise floor. It's like the base level of noise, the sound, when I hit the monitor button, that was the sound that you were hearing, right? Is this basic level of noise. And that's just the sound of the atmosphere, right? I mean, it's radio waves hitting my antenna, getting sucked into the radio and decoded. No signal there, just noise, okay? All right, so another one is battery saver. This is one that bites people. Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's the squelch. Exactly like that, right? Squelch is different from the volume, right? The squelch is different from the volume because your volume you can turn up. If your squelch is up, you won't hear any noise. But if your squelch is down, you'll hear the noise louder with the volume turned up, right? So battery saver is one that bites people on radios that have APRS built into them, because APRS is listening basically all the time for signals. But what battery saver does is it says, I'm just going to turn the whole radio off for like a tenth of a second, and then I'll turn it on for a tenth of a second, and then I'll turn it off for a tenth of a second, and then I'll turn it on for a tenth of a second. And it'll do that automatically, saving the battery because the circuits aren't powered for the time that it's off. They're only powered when it's on. If you're listening for audio signal, that's fine because somebody will key their radio up and the radio will notice that and say, oh, turn the battery saver off for a minute while we listen to this thing. And then, of course, when you transmit, it turns that off too. But when you're idle and you're on, when your squelch is engaged, then your battery is going to last longer because you're not exercising all the parts of the radio all the time. But if you're trying to use APRS, it might miss the first part of a transmission because it's off, right? And so it can get confusing because you'll be like, why am I not receiving anything on my APRS? I know people are out there and they're doing stuff, but I'm not receiving anything. That's one of the reasons why. Normally, I leave battery saver turned off because I try to have sufficient batteries available that I can leave my radio on when I need to. But if you're in a situation where you're worried about your battery life, like you're deployed somewhere and things, getting a charge for your battery might be difficult, you can turn that sucker on and it will help save your battery life. It'll save it quite a bit. It won't save it while you're transmitting, but it'll save it while your radio is idle. Backlight timeout. So that's another one. If I turn the radio on, if I do something to it, it's going to turn on a little backlight for the display. And that light will disappear after a period of time. So that backlight timeout is how long it waits to turn that light off. Some radios, they never turn it off. Some radios, they turn it off too fast. So you want to turn that up a little bit so it stays on a little bit longer. But that's just another setting that's fairly common. Beep is another one that I always turn on. That basically says, anytime I punch a button on my radio, it's going to beep at me. And that's great if I can't see what I'm doing. It's terrible if I know what I'm doing because I hear it beeping all the freaking time. And more to the point, my wife hears it beeping all the freaking time and she hates that. So I always turn the beep off. That beep is different from the Roger beep, which is another setting that you will hear. And I know, Steve, you usually have that turned on. The Roger beep means when you unkey after your transmission, it will play a little tone. Yeah. Steve always has it turned on, and so that's the reason I normally turn that off is because it can confuse people who are listening for a repeater tone, because the repeater tone won't fire until after the Roger beep fires, and then you'll hear doodly deep beep boop, and you'll be like, "What's all this beeping? I don't know where this is all coming from," right? So that's a thing. You can either turn that on or turn it off. A lot of people are used to having that turned on if they use GMRS, because GMRS radios usually have that turned on. It should be in your menu. Okay, you want to turn that off.
Menu again, the arrow will go down to on, then you push
Up or down,
up or down, it'll turn it off. It's off.
and then hit menu one more time to set it.
No,
You didn't, you truly didn't know you had that on? Ah. Okay. We just didn't worry about it. I
we
mean,
did.
all right. Next one is timeout timer. So what this is when you're transmitting, the radio is paying attention to how long you're transmitting. And if you hit this number, this timeout timer, it's usually a number of seconds or a number of minutes, it will stop transmitting, even if you're still holding the button down. Now, why is this important? What happens if you're in your car and your radio's on the seat and you're sitting on it and you're holding the push to talk button down with your leg or some other part of your anatomy, and everybody can hear you and you can't hear them because you're transmitting, right? So it's like, what am I going to do? Well, I don't even know that I'm doing it. But what will happen is at some point your timeout timer will kick in and your radio will drop the transmit, even though you're still holding the button. And then you'll be able to hear responses and stuff. But yeah. Is it illegal? Well, you're not allowed to.
Only if it causes music.
Yeah, you're not allowed to play music over the air unless you're in the space shuttle or space station, right? So, yeah, I don't know. That may be a concern. But one other thing about the timeout timer, most repeaters have a timeout timer built into them. It's quite often set at 3 minutes. And what that means is if you're long-winded and you're talking on your radio and you go past that 3 minutes, the repeater will stop listening at that point. And you're still talking and nobody else can talk, but the repeater's done with you at that point and it hangs up on you. And so you continue to blab and blab and blab until you finally stop and somebody else keys up and says, all right, we missed the last 3 minutes of what you said because the repeater timed out. So you'll often hear us when we're doing net control, we'll say something like break for reset, or if we're having a long conversation with somebody, we'll say, I'm going to reset, unkey, rekey up, that resets that timeout time. So not only do the repeaters have it, but a lot of radios have that setting as well. The other reason you don't want your radio to just continuously transmit is it's using power when it's transmitting, and power turns into heat. And so your radio can get quite hot if you're transmitting for a long time. Now, that's not so important of a deal with a mobile where you've got a separate mic from the radio. But if you're holding your handheld and you're having a long-winded conversation with yourself because everybody's given up and tuned away, your radio is going to start getting hot. And the reason it's doing that is because you're transmitting too long. Now, some radios, like mobiles, might have a fan built in. And as you're having your long-winded conversation, you'll hear the fan kick on. And that's a good indicator that, hey, I've probably been talking a little bit too long. Maybe I should stop and give somebody else a chance to use the frequency. So something to think about. All right, so that's timeout timer. The next one that I have here is display mode. So if you turn on your radio and it shows a name instead of a frequency, like mine is showing Mark Pry on the top and Ensign Peak on the bottom, that is an option to turn that on or off. And I actually have a function key set so I can hit that, and now it's just showing the numbers. So it says 147.16 for both of those. So Mark Pry and Ensign Peak are the same, if you didn't know that. But some radios, you have to actually go into the menu to change that. Switch to change it to, I want to see the channel name versus the frequency.
It might also be channel number.
There could also be a channel number, that's true. Some radios will show you the channel number all the time. Some won't. They'll only show it if you set it into channel number mode. Baofangs are famous for that. And they will show CH and a number, and you'll be like, oh, now I know what channel I'm on, but what is it? And you'll have to fiddle around in the menu and find the display setting and change it so you can see either the frequency or the name. So something to think about there. All right. More settings. Yes, there are a lot of settings for these radios. I've got a couple more columns of settings here. So we'll talk about some more common ones. Vox is a very common setting that nobody uses. Okay. Vox is voice operated transmit. And what that means is your radio will automatically key up when the microphone hears you talking or hears any other noise in the room talking, right? This can be useful if you've got a headset with some kind of boom microphone so it can only hear you and you're like riding a bike or something like that and you can't fiddle with your hands, you're trying to hold on to something. That's about the only time that's useful. Dan's shaking his head and waving at me.
I use it when I do Fox Hunt. I have a radio and a tape recorder, and my radio set to Vox, and it transmits when it's talking.
So when the tape recorder talks, the radio starts
Yeah,
transmitting.
and then
When the
and
tape
between
stops,
that, you reset.
it stops.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
that's an interesting use. Another place where I've seen it used typically is with things like digital modes. You might not have control over the PTT from your computer, but you can set the radio into Vox mode, and then when the computer spits out some audio, the radio will start transmitting. When the computer stops sending audio, the radio will stop transmitting. You can adjust the sensitivity of that as well. Yeah, it wouldn't be terribly useful if you couldn't, right? Sometimes you can set it like on a scale from 0 to 10. Sometimes you get like 3 levels, low, medium, and high, and good luck, right? I usually leave that turned on. Dual watch is another one that some radios have and some radios don't have. For example, when I was showing you on my Kenwood, and I said, look, here's Mark Pry and Ensign Peak on here. That's 2 separate VFOs. There's an A VFO and a B VFO. We'll talk about VFOs. Those are separate, and I can actually tune one of them. So now one is on Lake Mountain and one is on Mark Pry. And I can actually hear somebody on both of those. With this radio, I can hear them at the same time. And there's actually a setting I can set to change the balance between the A VFO and the B VFO. So I can make the A VFO louder and the B VFO quieter, or vice versa, using a setting on the radio. This is a real radio, right? Yeah, toy radios probably aren't going to do that. Now, on my Baofeng, it'll do that dual mode, but if one of those is receiving, the other one won't receive, okay? And on the TYT, it actually has 3 on there. So you can have 3 frequencies that you're listening to or monitoring. Again, only the one that starts talking first is the one you're gonna hear. You're not gonna know the other ones are doing anything until that first one stops, okay? So that's something to think about. You can still listen to it, yeah. And you can select which one of those bands you want to transmit on, right? So there's like an A/B button on here, and there's an A/B button on here that I can switch between which VFO is going to go off if I press the PTT. Now, the club has some of these Baofeng, what are they, UV88s or something like that? They actually have a push to talk button that's a two-part push to talk button. If you push the top of it, the AVFO will transmit. If you push the bottom of the push to talk button, the BVFO will transmit. So that's kind of cool. Not every radio has that feature either. But that's kind of a slick thing. Power on, welcome message. You'll hear it called different things. Basically what this is when you turn the radio on, it can show you a message. A lot of people put their call sign there. And that way, if you ever lose your radio, somebody picks it up, they turn it on, they can see your call sign, they can find you and give it back to you. Or they can reprogram it and do whatever they want with it, right?
I said thank you.
Yeah. Send a QSL card that says, thanks for the fine radio, right? Yeah, okay. So that's what the power on welcome message thing is for. You don't have to set that. I think out of the box, this radio had it set to hello with 2 exclamation marks. So, you know, it's different. All the radios are different with that. Next one that I want to talk about is FM bandwidth. And you'll see wide or narrow bandwidth. So let's talk about bandwidth for a minute. Because this is one that people get confused by. And they think, well, I don't want to use wide bandwidth, do I? Or narrow is going to save me something, right? It's going to be cheaper, or it's going to use less battery or something. No. So the FM bandwidth, there's typically broadcast FM uses about 75 kilohertz wide. Remember, FM is frequency modulation. So your center frequency, the frequency that you're tuned to, you're actually using some frequencies below that and some frequencies above that as your signal gets modulated onto that, okay? The broadcast FM band, that amount of bandwidth is about 75 kilohertz. Wide FM is about 5 kilohertz, okay? And narrow FM is about 2.5 kilohertz. Now, here in Utah, all of our repeaters use wide FM. So you want to set your radio for wide FM here in Utah, at least. Most places, I think, do that unless they're really, really dense. The only reason they would use narrow is if they need to pack more repeaters into the space that's available. So maybe California, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. If it's going to be different from wide, they will tell you that. Someone will tell you that. So what happens if you run narrow when you're supposed to be using wide, or vice versa? So if you're transmitting with narrow FM on a channel and everybody is listening on wide, you might get reports that your signal, your audio is low, okay? Because your voice is a quarter as loud as it ought to be when you're doing your thing there. Now, that can be a problem because, you know, people won't be able to hear you very well. And so that's one thing to consider. Now, if your radio is set for narrow on receive, what you're going to hear quite often is the signal will be too loud and maybe distorted because parts of it are getting chopped off. You're not picking up the whole width of the signal, right? You're using this little tiny chunk and they're using twice as much bandwidth. So you might miss out on the highs and the lows and it sounds kind of goofy. So that's something that you can notice. Also, signals will be extra loud because you're getting too much signal in the space that you should be using, right? So that can be a problem. Another weird thing that can happen is this effect called squelch clamping. And what that does is it's actually, so remember how we talked about the squelch, like here's the noise, and you set the squelch somewhere above the noise so that when the signal comes through, your radio opens the speaker and you can hear it. What happens with squelch clamping is the signal is so powerful that the radio says, I can't hear that. And it just won't open the squelch. So you don't hear anything. And that's not going to help you. So you want to make sure that you're using wide FM, at least here in Utah. And if you are somewhere outside of Utah, the place where you got the frequencies from should tell you if it's wide FM or narrow. Okay. In amateur radio, we mostly use wide FM. All right. And again, remember, that's only 5 kilohertz wide. So it's not like broadcast FM, which is 75 kilohertz wide. Okay. All right. So the next one I have on here is tuning step. So if you're ever like looking at a frequency and you start spinning your little tuning dial, that tells how much it will change each click or each time you change it, right? So typical values for that are 5 kilocycles, which remember, most of our frequencies are in these megahertz range, right? Like 2 meters, 144 megahertz to 148 megahertz. So it's the numbers to the right of the decimal point are the kilohertz. So if we set it to 5 kilohertz, that's like the third number over from the right, from the decimal point. So if you're tuning by 0.005 each time, that's what that's talking about. Some radios will let you set that to 15. Some will let you just set it to 25. It just depends on the radio. I usually leave it set at 5 myself, just because I like fine control of the frequency that I'm on. And as we experience today, if you're off just a little bit from the frequency, sometimes that can be beneficial if your signal is too strong. So that's the thing you can use on a fox hunt, for example. If you're close enough to it that you're picking up the signal, no matter which way you're turning, go off frequency 5 kilohertz and your signal will drop a little bit. Dan.
One of the most common issues that doing have radio operators have is they'll have their tuning step set to 12.5. That's a very common one, or 25, and they don't get the resolution that they need, first of all, but second of all, when they're at 12.5, now they can't go.
There's certain frequencies they can't get.
Yeah, and so they have, what the heck, my radio's broken.
Yeah,
No?
I can't tune the frequency that I'm trying to get because it's not a multiple of 12.5, right? So that's another valid point. You wouldn't be able to if your step is set to 12.5. You can't punch in a 0.10 because the radio won't do it. It'll want the 12.5, right? So that's something to consider. Or if you set it to 25, even worse, then you can't set it to 0.1 or 0.2, right? 0.01. 0.01, yeah. So I usually set it to 0.005, the lowest one I can get.
5 kilohertz, just the lowest one.
The lowest one I can get, because that gives me the most flexibility in what I do. Right. That gives me the most flexibility in what I'm setting. Now, again, some places will have their repeaters on these 12.5 kilohertz boundaries, because remember the signal is 5 kilohertz wide. So they can put them at 12.5 and be fine, but they can also put them at 10 and be fine because it will fit in there, right? So that's something to think about as well. So you can set it to 10, but then it'll mess you up if you go somewhere where it wants 12.5. But if you set it to 0.5 or 0.005, then it should work pretty much everywhere. All right. Last one on this common settings is voice prompt. Now, how many people have turned on their Baofeng and it says channel 1-3? And you tune it to the next one, channel 1-4. And then you hit the menu button that says menu, tone select. And you're like, what the heck is going on here? That's the voice prompt. That's the radio trying to help you, which is great if you're blind. If you're not blind, it's not so great. Okay. I always turn that off. I mean, if I take my glasses off, I'm probably blind enough, but I don't like the voice prompt. I find that really annoying to have the radios talking to me when it's not a person on the other end talking. That
The only
is,
thing worse than that is when she talks Chinese.
yes, that's the other problem, right? Because some radios will have a language selection, and if you buy a radio from China, chances are good that the default setting is Chinese. So figuring out which setting, which menu setting you need to go to change that to English is also challenging sometimes, right? Yeah, if you were blind and driving, it would help you a lot. It would help you a lot as you get arrested. And yes, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about some. That's right. All right, let's talk about some less common settings. So some less common settings are there's programmable buttons. Some radios will have programmable buttons. So let me see. This one does not. This one has two buttons on the side here. And you can actually change what these buttons do on some radios. Not on every radio, on some radio, right? So that is a setting that you can, if you have like, oh, I never use the monitor mode, so I don't want to have a button dedicated to monitor, but I want to be able to see or change my power setting without having to go into the menu. So I'm going to assign that button to change the power setting. And then anytime I hit that button, it changes the power setting, right? Some radios like this one, it's got, what does it have? It's got two, PF1 and PF2. This radio has one, it just says PF on it, and I can do something with that. Some radios, if you're using a hand mic, there might be buttons on the hand mic, and you can adjust what those do. Some mics have like 4 buttons on them. That's a great thing because now I can program 4 different buttons. Some radios will let you program any function on those buttons. Some radios will only give you a subset of radio functions that you can set. This is probably the only thing I don't like about my Anytone 5888 is I cannot set one of the mic programmable function buttons to switch the display mode between channel name and frequency. I would love to be able to do that. Like I showed you on here, I have my PF button set to do that. The Anytone does not allow me to make that selection. That is not one of the available things I can program a button to do. Why? I don't know, but that's how they set it up in the radio. So some radios will have more capability in that regard than other radios, and that's just something that's just how the radio is, and so you have to deal with it.
The amount of programmable buttons you have is proportionally equal to the cost of the radio.
Well, I don't know if that's the case because my Anytone 878 has like 5 programmable buttons on the panel, and it costs less than this thing. So
That one also program.
correct. Yeah, on the 878, if you press the button, that's one thing. If you press and hold the button, that's a different function. You can program it for 2 different functions, every button. So that's pretty slick. I didn't bring my 878. I should have brought that one with me, but true. You do have to remember which button does what, right? And that's probably an advantage of having only one button because then you always know what it does, right? Another one is display color. The Baofangs will let you change the display color a lot of times. Not all of them. This one won't, but a lot of them will allow you to change, like set the red, green, and blue values for the display color. And you can actually go in and change it to whatever color you want. Some of them, like this one does do, it has like 3 separate colors that it uses. So like when it's transmitting, it's one color. When it's receiving, it's a different color. And when it's idle, it's a third color. So that's kind of cool. But I mean, is it a great feature? I don't know. It's kind of cool. Okay, scanning. These radios can do scanning, right? Not all radios can do that, but at least these ones I know can do that. However, how they do scanning might be a little bit different. So some radios will be able to scan either memories or on the VFO, and we'll talk about the difference between memories and VFO in a minute. Some of them you can actually lock out a frequency. So if it stops on a particular frequency, stop scanning on a particular frequency because there's something happening there, and you hear it, and it's just like something going beep 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 beep, beep continuously. You can lock that frequency out of your scan, and then it won't stop on that next time. It'll skip it next time, right? So that's kind of a cool feature. These are not general purpose scanners, and I would never say buy a Baofeng if you want a scanner, because if you want a scanner, buy a scanner. But if you've already got a Baofeng, you can do some scanning with that. Now, they're not going to do things like decode the P25 system that the fire department is using or the police department is using. They don't have that trunk tracker capability built in or any of that on these radios. They're pretty low scale when it comes to scanning. But a lot of them will have multiple options for scan resume. Now, what that means is it's scanning along, checking all these frequencies. It finds one where somebody's talking. So it stops so you can hear what they say. There's a couple of options that you can set for how it continues on from that point. Time-based basically means it'll stop when it hears a signal. It'll wait until a timer runs out, maybe 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then it'll just start scanning again, even if they're still talking. You can have it stop and hold, which is where it will stop on that frequency and it'll stay on that frequency until you tell it to start scanning again. And then you can have it on idle, which basically means it'll stop on that frequency while somebody's talking, but as soon as they stop talking, it'll take off again and start scanning again. So you won't hear the next guy talk until it wraps all the way around and comes back to where that frequency was again. So those are some options that a lot of radios are going to have. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about some. Why is this not going forward? Okay, let's talk about some settings that you will not use. Okay, there are some settings you will never use as an amateur radio operator. Some radios will have a setting called 2-tone or 5-tone. Some radios will have a setting called 1750 hertz tone. Some radios will have a thing called a compounder, and some radios will have some kind of encryption or scrambling capability. We do not use these settings in the US in amateur radio. Now, 2-tone and 5-tone basically means the radio is listening for a particular tone sequence. These are typically DTMF tones. It's listening for a particular tone sequence before we'll unlock the squelch or open the squelch. And the reason for that is so that your radio can be addressed individually. So you've got a bunch of people with radios all on the same frequency, and you only want Joe to hear what you have to say. So you send Joe's 5-tone code, and only his radio opens the squelch, so only he can hear you. You're still talking on this frequency. Everybody's radio is picking it up. They're just not turning the speaker on so that they don't hear it. We don't generally use that. 1750 hertz tone is used a lot in Europe to open up a repeater. So we don't use that here in the US. Basically what that is, it's a lead-in tone at this particular frequency. This tone fires first and then it stops. The repeater hears that tone, it starts listening, and then it repeats whatever it hears after that. We don't use that in the US. We tend to use CTCSS and DCS and things like that. We'll talk about that again in a minute when we get into programming. Compounder, this is one I had to look up because I've never used this and I was like, what the heck is compounder? I don't even know what that does. It's a compressor and expander. That's where compander, compress and expander, right? And what it does is it takes the audio and compresses it into a narrower set of, or narrower bandwidth, I guess you'd say. And then on the receiving side, it expands it back out again so you can hear it again. So why would you use this? Well, let's say you have a jillion repeaters in your area and they're using every 5 kilohertz spot on the thing. You're going to be using narrow FM, but the compander lets you squeeze it down even further, right? We don't use that in amateur radio. That's something that is not generally used in amateur radio. And then, of course, encryption and scrambling, that's not allowed. You can't do encryption on amateur radio. It's against the regulations. So we don't have that. Why would my radio have these features if I cannot use them or I will never use them? Some of these radios are sold in more than one market. Okay. So, for example, this is the Kenwood THD72A for America. There's also a Kenwood THD72E for Europe. That's going to have the 1750 hertz tone. Okay. It's going to have that capability. My radio doesn't have that capability.
Your radio has the capability, we don't use that.
Correct. Correct. We don't use that capability here in the US. The radio can do that, obviously, because it's the same physical radio, right? I have a radio, a Kenwood THF6A, that is a tribander, but if you get the THF6E, or they call it the F7, it's the exact same physical radio, but a diode has been removed from the board, and that radio will not work on the 1.25 meter band because other countries don't have that band. Other countries, amateur radios don't get that band. We have it here in the US, they don't get it. So you can physically change the radio from an A model to an E model by opening it up and finding that particular diode on the board and pulling it off of there. And then now suddenly it's an E model and it won't do the 1.25. Conversely, if you have an E model, you can solder a new diode on that spot and turn it into an A model. Okay, so you can do that. Remember, we're hams. We're allowed to muck around inside our radios. We're supposed to be smart enough to do that without doing something illegal. Supposed to be, right? So, dude, I used to work with this guy, and he was doing some rework on a board, and so he's got this circuit board, and he's looking through a microscope at this board, and he's like resoldering a chip. And this chip has the little tiny traces that are like less than a millimeter apart. And he's like, and he goes down the whole side of the chip. And then he goes to the next one. And he's like tapping each one of these with his soldering iron. And I'm watching him like, dude, how do you do that? I couldn't do that. And he's like, I've been doing this. This is what I do. I'm an electronics technician. This is what I do. I know how to do this. You know, this is my thing. And it just blew my mind when I was watching him do this. And like, how? Because I couldn't do that. You know, and I've seen some videos of people like, it's actually pretty slick because they'll put this solder paste on the board and some flux, and they'll drop the chip on it and heat it up with a heat gun, and the chip will like slide into position and lock into the place where it wants to be, which is where all of those pins are where they're supposed to be. And I'm like, mind blown. How does that happen? I don't know, but it's crazy. Electronics technicians are nuts. Anyway, so some radios are sold in other countries where they have different features that they want you to have or not have. Some radios are sold as commercial radios. And so as a commercial radio, it's perfectly fine to have the compander and encryption and all of that stuff in the country where it's sold as a commercial radio. But as hams, we're not allowed to use that. So we don't. Okay. Let's go on. All right, we're going to talk about tuning. So some radios will hide some of these things in the menu. Some radios will provide you with a different way to set some of these values. Again, it depends on the radio, and you'll need to look at your manual to figure out how to program this stuff. But we're going to talk about how to get these things in there. Okay, so these are settings that are specific to the frequency. We have two things that we want to talk about: channels and VFOs. VFO stands for, help me out, variable frequency oscillator, right? It's the actual thing that does the radio. That's the radio, okay? It's the transmitter and the receiver. It's the thing that tells the transmitter and receiver circuitry what frequency to transmit and receive on, okay? So when I say my radio is in VFO mode, all I'm saying is I'm able to punch in a specific frequency. Channel mode, all those frequencies are stored in channels. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I select the channel that I want to get the frequency that I want. But any setting that I do in a memory for that, for the channels, I can do manually directly on the VFO. So we're going to talk about some of these. So receive frequency. This is the frequency that the radio is going to receive. If you want to stick around, I can give you a ride after we're done. Half an hour? You want to wait? Okay. So receive frequency, that is the frequency that the radio is going to receive. It's the frequency that your repeater is going to be transmitting on. Or if you're in simplex, it's the same thing, right? But that's the receive frequency. Some radios will have you set a receive frequency and a transmit frequency. The transmit frequency is the frequency the repeater is listening to. So when you transmit on a different frequency from the frequency you're receiving on. That's how repeaters work, okay? Some radios have you set that transmit frequency specifically. Some radios just have you set an offset. The Kenwoods, for example, you can set the offset for a particular band, and it will use that same offset for all of the frequencies on that band. On the 2-meter band, the offset is 600 kilohertz. On the 1.25 meter band, it's 1.6 megahertz. And on the 70 centimeter band, it is 5 megahertz. So that's the offset. Now, if your radio doesn't let you set the offset, you might have to do some math to figure out what transmit frequency you need to set based on the receive frequency of the repeater. When you go look it up on the repeater site and you see, oh, this is the frequency of the repeater, that's your receive frequency. You need to make sure your transmit frequency or your offset are set correctly. Offset could be positive offset or negative offset. Now, on 1.25 meter and 70 centimeter in Utah, at least, it's always a negative offset. But on 2 meter, it depends on where in the band that frequency is, if it's going to be a positive 600 hertz or a negative 600 kilohertz or a negative 600 kilohertz, right? So if they're towards the top of the band, it'll be a negative offset. If they're towards the bottom of the band, it'll be positive offset, most likely. Some ones around the middle of the band might be one way or another. It kind of depends. Also, there will be simplex frequencies scattered about in there as well. So you need to keep that in mind. If you're doing a simplex frequency, your transmit and your receive are the same. Your offset is 0 or no offset, right? And so there's no direction associated with that. No positive or negative. On the Kenwood, it will actually show me a little tiny plus or a little tiny minus telling me if it's a negative offset or a positive offset, which is kind of slick. So if I switch it to Mark PRI, it's got a little tiny plus because that's a positive offset. And if I switch it to Lake Mountain, it's got a little tiny minus sign because that's a negative offset. Okay. So the next thing is tone. So there's a few different options for tone. Really, I guess there's four, right? No tone is one option. Tone basically says your radio will transmit a subaudible tone. That means it's a tone that is at a frequency that is below what you can hear. Okay. This doesn't mean that it's quieter. It just means it's a lower frequency than the human hearing can hear. It'll transmit that continuously as long as you're holding the PTT down. And the repeater is listening for that tone, and it won't start listening to you unless it hears that tone. Okay. So you look up a repeater and it says it has a tone, like our repeater has a tone of 103.5 hertz. If you're transmitting on our repeater's frequency, but you're not sending that tone, the repeater won't pay attention to you. Okay. The CTCSS, you had something?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that's almost correct.
There are times, so if dude A is transmitting with his tone and he stops transmitting and dude B starts transmitting without a tone, but the repeater's already still listening to A, it hasn't hung up yet, sometimes it will still transmit what you're saying.
Well, that's not what I was gonna say, but that's very true.
That's not what were you gonna say?
The other thing is, some people can hear 256
Oh,
hertz.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, that's not the point of the tone, the subaudible tone is only subaudible because the radio locks it out. The radio, whether it's a repeater or your HT.
It'll filter it out.
It will hear the 105.3 hertz tone, and he will say, okay, this is a valid transmission, but I'm not going to pass the 103 hertz tone into the speaker.
Okay.
So
Dan makes the point that the radios will filter that out, and so you won't hear that subaudible tone through the speaker of your radio. And neither will the repeater, right? So CTCSS, carrier, continuous tone, carrier sense squelch, continuous coded squelch signal. Okay. So what this is, basically, it's just like tone. Your radio is going to send the tone, but your radio is also going to listen for the tone coming back to it when the repeater is talking. And we don't normally use that. Some places you will use that because repeaters are close to each other and you don't want to hear the repeater that you don't want to hear. But in general, we don't normally use that. And a lot of repeaters will not send the tone. Ours, I think, will not send the tone. So it can, but we don't have it configured to. We may change that setting because that setting can help with the Echolink configuration. So we're experimenting with Echolink on a repeater, and that's one of the things that we may look at making some changes to. But that won't change the fact that if your radio is not listening for CTCSS, it's going to hear everything. Okay. So when you have your GMRS radio and they say, look at this great radio, it has 500 privacy channels. It doesn't. It has the same 22 channels that every GMRS radio has, but it has subaudible tones on there as well. And so if you're set to use a subaudible tone on your GMRS radio, you won't hear the guy next to you who's transmitting without that tone, but he's still using the frequency and the frequency is still busy. Okay. And if you hit the monitor button, you will hear it. There's no privacy. There's no security. There's no, it's not really a privacy. The Motorola used to call it private line. And so you'll often hear it called a PL tone, right? It's not really private. And that's something you need to be aware of because there is no privacy in amateur radio. If you can hear it, you can hear it. And if you set your radio to hear every tone, not pay attention to the tone on receive, then it's going to hear any tone no matter what people are saying. We generally do not use tones on simplex because it doesn't really buy you anything. And it can cause problems where somebody's got the tone set on their radio and somebody else doesn't, and so they can't hear them. So, that it doesn't do you any good to have a radio for talking to people if you can't hear what they're saying. The other one is DCS, and that is digital coded squelch, I think it's called. Is that right? I'm seeing. Here in Utah, I think there's only maybe one, if I remember right. I don't remember which one it is, but I think there is one.
There are 3 in the standard load.
There are 3 in the standard load. So what DCS is it basically encodes a number in a subaudible tone that, again, you can't hear. And if the radio is not sending that number, the receiving radio will ignore it. If it is sending it, then it will not ignore it.
So it's not a tone,
it's a sequence of numbers, right?
Digital.
It's a digital number. There's I think people don't use it because they don't need it, right? It's not that it's any more difficult to set it. I mean, if you set it on your radio, put it in DCS mode, you can just pick the code that you want. It's not hard to pick it.
Except with DCS, you also have the positive and negative. It's more, unless you have a reason to use it. I mean,
yeah,
it's easily used if you know what you're doing.
If you need to use it, it's easy to do it.
But you have to understand it.
The advantage of it, there isn't a big advantage to it. The last thing I have on this line is split tone. And what that is the repeater is wanting a specific tone to listen to you, and it's using a different tone to talk to you. So your radio needs to be able to have a separate transmit tone from the receive tone, or just not have a tone for receive, right? Not all radios will do split tone. For example, the Kenwoods don't do split tone. They do not. If you want to do split tone, you have to use both VFOs and set one VFO for receiving and the other VFO for transmitting.
That's not split tone.
It's using 2 VFOs. Exactly. It's not split tone. The Baofengs will do split tone just fine. When you go into the menu, there's a transmit tone setting and a receive tone setting, and you can set them independently. And they do that just fine. I don't know about Yaesus. I don't have any Yaesus. So there will be a way to set the radio into a specific mode, tone, CTCSS, or DCS. And there will be a way to set the specific tone or DCS code that is being used. Okay. So that may be in the menu. It may be in a sub menu. It may be somewhere weird that you're not thinking about, but you need to figure out from your manual where that's at so you can set that, because a lot of repeaters are going to want a tone before they will listen to you. Ragnar says that when he used to operate up around East Canyon Resort, they would use split tone a lot because there was a lot of noise, and the radio would open for the noise because the squelch setting, right? And so you would be getting a lot of noise that you didn't want. So they used a split tone so they could identify specifically which signals they wanted to receive. So that is a case where you might use the split tone. Power. And I'm not talking about the power button to turn the radio on and off. I'm talking about how much power, transmit power, your radio is going to put out. What does the FCC say we should use? The minimum power that you can to accomplish the goal, right? To accomplish your communications. Dan and I were experimenting with simplex in our cars today, trying to figure out how far apart we could get before we couldn't really understand each other on low power. Low power on those radios is 5 watts. high power on this radio is 5 watts. Okay, so that's being able to set the power level can be very important. If like I was doing crossband repeat on my radio in the car, and I'm using my handheld to transmit to the car radio and have it retransmit, I want to set my handheld to the lowest amount of power I can, which is, I think on this radio, 1/8 of a watt or something like that. And then my battery lasts a heck of a lot longer because I'm using so low power to transmit. But my car radio with the 12-volt battery is putting out 50 watts on the output. So it's doing that crossband repeat. We did a class on crossband repeat a while ago. Dan.
If you recall, the first couple parades that we did for the Murray Amateur Radio Club at Murray City, I was a crossband repeat. I had my band up at the head of the front of the parade where the parade started. And I used my radio, I transmitted on UHF at 300 milliwatts to my band that was 100 feet over there. And then I was transmitting from my band on 2 meter, 50 watts. So that
everybody could hear.
So that everybody could hear.
It was almost like you had your own little mini repeater, basically.
Yeah. And I could talk all day on my 300 milliwatts.
Right. And your battery is going to last a long time on 300 milliwatts, right? So very, very useful to be able to set that power level. Some radios will have a button on the front panel that allows you to set the power level. Some radios will require you to go into the menu and change it there. Some radios will allow you to set a specific power level for a memory channel. We'll talk about memory channels in a sec. But power is another setting that can be associated with that. The name, you can assign a name to the frequency, and that is typically for memory channels only. And the skip lockout function that we talked about in scanning, that is typically memory channels only. Okay. So let's go on more on tuning. So frequency is typically entered in megahertz. Remember, the decimal point is the place between megahertz and kilohertz. 2 meter band, 144 to 148 megahertz. Why aren't the transmit and receive the same? We've talked about repeaters and how the repeater is listening on a specific frequency. So you need to transmit on the frequency the repeater is listening to. And then the repeater is transmitting at the same time on a different frequency. So your radio needs to be set to receive the frequency the repeater is transmitting on. And that way, that signal gets up to the repeater and back to whoever's receiving. Offset direction, we already talked about. Tone, we already talked about the difference between repeated or transmitted tone and received tone. We talked about DCS, and we talked about split tone, and that some radios can't do split tone. All right, let's talk about memories versus VFO. So remember, I talked about the VFO is the variable frequency oscillator. That's the actual radio part, right? And the memory is just a place where you can store the VFO settings. So you're going to set up the VFO to a specific transmit, receive frequency, tone, power level, all that kind of stuff goes in to the VFO settings. And then you take that bundle of information and you store it in a memory location. And that way, when you put your radio into memory mode, you can flip between those stored settings without having to go punch back in all the numbers every time. They're essentially channels, right? So when we talk about memories, we're talking about channels, okay? So like today we did on our check-in net, we started off on channel 31 in the standard load, which was the Murray simplex frequency. And then we had everybody QSY or change frequency to channel 36, which was the Butterfield peak repeater. And if you had your standard load in your radio, all you had to do was turn your memory dial to channel 36 and you were all set. You were there. If you didn't, you would have had to punch in the new frequency, set up the tone setting, get all of that configured, and then you could transmit. So the memories are basically a shortcut way to set that information up. Most radios have some number of memory locations or slots or channels. Each slot holds all of the information for tuning to a specific thing. So frequency, a tone, all of that stuff for a specific configuration. And a lot of them will allow you to specify a name for the channel. Not all radios will let you specify a name. First radio I ever used was a Radio Shack HTX 202. It had 10 memory channels, and all it showed you on the screen was the frequency number and the channel number, and that was it. And so if you didn't know what you were doing, you were out of luck, man. You had to know channel 1 is going to be Farnsworth, and channel 2 is going to be Ensign Peak, and so on. But a lot of radios will have the ability to specify a name. Some radios will give you 6 characters for the channel name. Some will give you 8 characters for the channel name. Some will give you some ridiculous unlimited number of characters for the channel name, like the 878, which I think you can put in whatever you want and it'll take it.
16.
Is it 16? So when you're setting up something like the standard load, you want to make it the lowest common denominator. So you try to set all those channel names to actually make sense with only 6 characters. There's a lot of radios will have 6 characters. I imagine there are probably some radios that only have 5, which would be a terrible thing. But yeah, that's just how you get it. Most radios are going to have at least 128 memories. Baofeng has 128. TYT has 128. This radio has 1,000. This radio, I don't even know how many of these radios have. 2,000, something like that. Some ridiculous amount of memories. This is the D74, the Kenwood D74. The Anytone 878. It's a DMR radio, and you can put 3,000, 5,000, 4,000,
The old version.
some ridiculous number of memories, right? Yeah. So the plus model is probably like 8,000 or something like that. It's crazy. But yeah, so you can program those in. Some radios have thousands of memory locations that you can set. Some radios will have the memories organized into what they call banks or groups. So like on my F6A, for example, it has the memories are in blocks of 50, and there are 8 blocks of 50. So what is that? 400 memories that it has. And I can actually set it so that if I'm scanning, it only scans 1 block of those, not the whole 400 frequencies, but just the 50 in that block. This is what most radios don't do that, but some radios will have that functionality. Some radios will be able to store more general configuration in memory banks. For example, on the 5888 UV3, it has 2 banks, which they call hypermemories. And so that memory will actually store all of the radio settings. And you can switch from hypermemory A to hypermemory B just by hitting a button. And your radio is essentially a completely different radio, a completely different set of memories and everything else. The Kenwood 710, I think, has 4 of those that you can set, that you can put between different configurations. All right. A couple ways to program your radio. First way is from the front panel. Radio has a keypad on it. You can punch in numbers from the keypad. Second way is with software. All right. I'm gonna have to, I'm like nowhere near done with this thing. So we may have to finish this next time just because I'm gonna run out of time and I gotta get Dave home. So we'll go as far as we can get and then we'll figure it out. So where do I get the frequencies? How do I know what frequency to use? Here in Utah, we have a frequency coordinator called the Utah VHF Society, and they are responsible for figuring out what frequencies are assigned to what.
I say John Lloyd is a frequency coordinator.
He's the guy, right? But as part of the Utah VHF Society, I mean, if John got hit by a truck, we'd still need a frequency coordinator. So, no, it's strictly volunteer type of thing.
the ARRL gives the frequency coordinator limits to what you can do as far as setting up the frequencies. They decide offsets, they decide
Yeah, they say which
frequency pairs.
parts of the band are for what, right?
They have to.
It's a
run
gentleman's
under the
agreement.
auspices of FCC rules.
Yeah, it's a gentleman's agreement, basically, as far as how that goes. And
The FCC allows, just like Ken was alluding to, the FCC allows leeway into how we want to do it
Yeah.
in Utah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you go to this website, click on the Utah repeater list, you'll find a list of repeaters on 6 meters, 2 meters, 1.25 meters, and 70 centimeters. There are some other bands as well. Most people don't have radios that will operate on those other bands, but you can run repeaters on 10 meters. I know Paul is working on building a 10-meter repeater, but HF, we don't use repeaters on HF. So typically you won't find them they won't be managed by the VHF Society. Find the band that you want, find the repeater that you want. They're in order by receive frequency. All the information will be there. Remember, the offset's different for each band. On 6 meters, the offset is always 1 megahertz. On 2, and it's always negative. On 2 meters, the offset is 600 kilohertz, or 0.6 megahertz, and the direction depends on where you are in the band. 1.25 meters is 1.6 megahertz, and 70 centimeters is 5 megahertz. Those are both always negative. Okay. No, I don't think so. I don't have a radio that'll do 6 meters. There are some 6 meter repeaters around that are linked to 2 meter repeaters. So you might be on a repeater and talking to someone and they're on 6 meters and you're not, right? So that's, that can happen. So they also have the 33 centimeter band and 23 centimeter band. Like I say, most people don't have a radio that will do those. I've got one that'll do the 1.2 gigahertz, but I have to use a hack custom firmware to make it do that, and it's pretty noisy. So I don't really do that very much. We'll take a look at the VHF website later. We may have to do those demos next time. So if you're not in Utah, you need to find a repeater list or the frequency coordinator for wherever you are. That could be a national thing if you're in a different country. It could be your particular state. You can also look at RFinder. The ARRL has contracted with RFinder to maintain repeater lists in the US. VHF Society was really upset about that when it first happened, because the mechanism for giving the repeater information to the ARRL changed, and it was much harder for them to come up with a programmatic way of doing that. I believe they have solved that problem now. But if you go to RFinder, you can search for repeaters wherever you happen to be. So if you're traveling somewhere, like, oh, I'm going to go to Minnesota, be in Minneapolis, I can find a list of repeaters that are around Minneapolis area. RFinder is a subscription service. It costs about $15 a year. So that's another reason why people were upset when the ARRL said we're going to use RFinder for our frequency management. It's out there. I don't think you have to sign up. You don't have to subscribe to be able to search it. But if you want to do certain things with it, like link it into your configuration software and stuff like that, then you have to subscribe.
Repeater book is free. It does
everything. Yeah. So repeater book is another place. Okay. So first thing for programming from the front panel, you know what? I'm just going to call it here, because I've got 7 more slides to go, and I don't want to run out of time. So I will bring this stuff next time, which will be the first week of April. So that will be what, April 4th, and we will finish this. We'll do the demos. we'll bring your radios. If you don't have your radio program, bring your radio, bring any programming cables that you've got, and we'll finish this next time. But I don't want to drag this past, and we've only got 5 minutes left for the thing. So I will stop the recording at this point if I can figure out where it is. There it is. There it was. Now it's gone. There it is. And we will continue next time.